In a laboratory setting, a modern healthcare AI can hit 99% accuracy. It handles perfectly clean data, optimizes a clear mathematical loss function, and outputs a highly confident prediction. Then, that same model is deployed into a live hospital ward. It collides with reality. Within weeks, the system crashes, clinicians mute the alerts, and the predictive power collapses. Consider IBM Watson for oncology. $5 billion went into building a system that could parse medical literature and recommend cancer treatments. Yet when placed in actual clinical workflows, the system struggled to interpret routine, messy health records and faced resistance from the oncologists it was meant to help. Or look at the Epic sepsis model. This algorithm was technically capable of flagging blood infections, but upon deployment across hundreds of hospitals, it triggered an immediate clinical backlash, creating far more chaos than clarity. These systems fail because of the context gap, a structural disconnect between the controlled variables an engineer optimizes for and the high-stakes, unpredictable physical environment a nurse or doctor navigates. Real deployment breaks models across 3 specific friction points. First, human cognitive limits. Second, structural bias, where algorithms learn from billing codes instead of clinical truth. And third, the absence of causal logic in models trained only on statistical correlations. A perfect area under the curve is meaningless if the algorithm optimizes the wrong target, arrives at the wrong point in a physician's workflow, or ignores the physical realities of the system it is trying to improve. A hospital ward is an environment of intense sensory overload. In information theory, signal detection requires filtering a true message from surrounding noise. When an AI generates an alert, it is not a standalone message. It is one tiny signal competing against pagers, alarms, and the immediate physical needs of sick patients. A physician actively treating multiple acute cases faces a strict working memory bottleneck. The human brain can only hold and process a handful of distinct variables at once. Every interruption carries a quantifiable cognitive time penalty. Researchers call this resumption lag. When an AI pings a doctor to look at a screen, the doctor loses focus on their current task. It takes valuable seconds to rebuild the mental context of what they were doing before the computer interrupted them. This timeline represents a clinician's 12-hour shift. The Epic sepsis model looked great in internal validation because those tests assumed a frictionless user. The engineers measured accuracy while completely ignoring the cognitive load required to evaluate each prediction alongside checking vitals, writing notes, and talking to patients. To avoid missing any sick patients, the developers tuned the model to prioritize sensitivity over precision. The result was a volume of false positive sepsis alerts so high that the algorithm was flagging nearly everyone. The clinical consequence is alert fatigue. Faced with hundreds of useless warnings, doctors developed reflex muscle memory. They employed the 3-second dismiss, clicking away the AI alert without reading it, just to clear the screen and get back to their real work. Fixing this requires shifting from a binary alert system to tiered alerting architectures. The system must assess the severity of the alert and run an interruptibility detection protocol, determining mathematically if the prediction is urgent enough to break the physician's current concentration. If a user interface forces a clinician to actively tune out warnings to do their job, the model has failed. The precision of the code does not matter if the human endpoint is forced into cognitive denial. While the user interface dictates how an algorithm is received, the data layer dictates what the algorithm actually believes is true. Most healthcare models are trained on electronic health records, but an EHR is not an objective diary of clinical reality. It is a financial ledger, engineered to document billable claims for insurance providers. When algorithms look at these financial records, they see severe mathematical imbalances. Healthcare costs do not follow a normal symmetrical distribution curve. This graph illustrates what data scientists call the 5% rule. A tiny fraction of the patient population, those with complex chronic illnesses, drives the vast majority of systemic spending, creating a massive spike on a long-tail distribution. A few years ago, the healthcare company Optum deployed an algorithm designed to identify high-risk patients so hospitals could proactively enroll them in extra care management programs. The developers lacked a single clean variable for sickness, so they made a logical, fatal substitution. They instructed the AI to optimize for historical spending, assuming that the patients who cost the most money were inherently the sickest. That assumption collapses when you compare marginalized demographics against non-marginalized groups with the exact same burden of chronic conditions. Because of systemic barriers like lack of transportation, underinsurance, and unequal access to primary care, marginalized patients interacted with the medical system less frequently. They generated fewer billing claims and spent less money, even while managing the exact same level of severe illness. The algorithm ingested this financial ledger and treated it as clinical fact. Because the marginalized patients had lower historical costs, the model systematically downgraded their triage priority, pushing healthier patients to the front of the line. In data science, this is known as informative missingness. Often, what is absent from the dataset, a missed appointment, a lack of preventative screening, is a louder signal of a struggling patient than the billing codes that actually made it into the system. Engineers who blindly trust financial proxies without auditing their data for equalized odds build engines that scale and automate historical discrimination. The same challenge is now arriving at the technological frontier, large language models. These systems are moving into production via automated prior authorization agents and ambient scribes that draft clinical notes in real time. There is a severe architectural mismatch here. LLMs operate entirely on statistical correlation, predicting the next most probable word based on training data. Clinical medicine, however, is strictly bound by causal logic. This leads to dangerous behaviors like model sycophancy. If a doctor inputs a flawed diagnostic assumption, an LLM will frequently agree with them and fabricate supporting evidence because its internal reward function prioritizes being agreeable over being medically correct. To separate predictive machine learning from medical intervention, we use this structure, Judea-Pearl's causal ladder. The bottom rung represents observational data. A model at this level can only tell us that patients who took a specific drug happened to recover. It notes the correlation. But prescribing medicine requires the top rung. A doctor has to know the counterfactual. Would this specific patient have improved if they had chosen a different treatment, or if they had taken no drug at all? Standard neural networks and probabilistic text generators cannot answer counterfactual questions. They can only regurgitate patterns they have seen before. Bridging this gap requires mathematical tools like inverse probability weighting and propensity score matching. These methods restructure historical hospital logs, weighting the observational data to simulate the controlled conditions of a randomized clinical trial. They isolate the specific effect of an intervention, filtering out the background noise. Without a rigorous causal inference layer, plugging an LLM directly into a hospital system creates an articulate hallucination machine, highly confident, beautifully formatted, and completely detached from physical reality. Scaling AI out of the laboratory requires zooming out from the model itself and redesigning the surrounding operational infrastructure. A viable deployment rests on 3 pillars: respecting the attention economy, auditing proxies for bias, and governing with causal logic. The industry is currently solving the reliability problem of generative text by wrapping these probabilistic models inside strict deterministic safety constraints. This is the clinical auditor loop. The language model is an analytical engine, never speaking directly to the user. Outputs hit the auditor checkpoint to verify text, map billing codes, and enforce causal boundaries. Only verified data reaches the physician. Achieving high accuracy on a validation dataset is impressive, but it is only the starting line. The future of medical AI requires engineers to move past laboratory validation and start building systems designed to operate safely within the messy realities of the healthcare system.